Joanna Hogg burst onto the British film scene in 2007 with the astonishingly accomplished debut feature Unrelated. She arrived as this almost miraculous auteur and made 3 films in a row that are very similar. Now, her new movie The Souvenir is out in UK cinemas. I think it did a limited release earlier in the year in the US. And it represents a significant change in her work, as well as being a fantastic film in its own right. Like the rest of Hogg's films, the plot of The Souvenir is simultaneously hard to define in a single sentence and yet surprisingly light on details. At the most basic level, the plot follows Honor Swinton Byrne's character, Julie, as she navigates a relationship with a complex yet charismatic and slightly unsuitable older man. And alongside that, she's heading to film school and trying to develop herself as an artist. I should get the basics out of the way early on. The film is a gorgeously acted, sumptuously shot, and riveting, painful examination of this unsuitable romance that's taking place. And where Hogg really distinguishes herself as a writer and as a director of actors is in making that film not feel judgmental. There's very few moments in the film where I really felt like I was taking sides, which is astonishing considering just how nasty Anthony, Tom Burke's character, the unsuitable older man, can be at various points in the movie. In terms of structuring the film and telling the story in a visual way, Hogg really builds on her previous work here. Hogg's previous films aren't exactly simple, but they are straightforward, I think. They are mostly made with very limited casts and with very limited settings as well. They can feel slightly claustrophobic. And in fact, Hogg's most recent film, Exhibition, is notable for having essentially just 2 characters really in the movie. There's a number of other people who come in and out, but it's essentially a two-hander that takes place in a modernist home that the characters very rarely leave, and the camera very rarely leaves it too. Hogg's also famous for improvisation and long, static takes, and the opening of The Souvenir doesn't feel like that at all. The camera shakes, it's in these loud parties, and there's a full kind of jukebox soundtrack almost of music of the era that sets the tone really effectively, but also feels extremely different to her previous films that don't even have incidental music. The characters and the camera move around a lot more than Hogg's previous films as well. For instance, we visit the Wallace collection, which is where you can see the painting that the film is named after. There's plenty of stuff on the street. People drive up and down a motorway, and we go to visit the family homes in the countryside of both of the main characters. And then, in a show of immense control, Hogg reduces the film down to its absolute most basic parts to mirror the increasing confinement and claustrophobia of the relationship between the 2 main characters. And we spend a large chunk of the film sitting with basically the main 2 characters in this small flat where Julie lives. So it's clear that with the apparent increase in exposure that Hogg is getting from this film having a wider release and having executive producer Martin Scorsese attached to it, as well as a bona fide movie star in Tilda Swinton, this film is also showing Hogg as an ambitious and clever filmmaker. You could say that her previous 3 movies are essentially very similar, and this film feels identifiable as a Hogg movie, yet vastly different, suddenly expansive in scope, and using quite different visual language at points. I was amazed to see several sequences of the film switch between different cameras. There's a moment where Tom Burke's character gets into the lift and says goodbye to Julia, a kind of important point in the film. And it switches from the format that we're used to a sudden shot of Super 8. We also see moments from the future of the characters interspersed into the edit of the film, non-chronologically, which is incredibly different to Hogg's previous work that's all told very strictly in order. In one brief sequence in the film that's been featured quite heavily in the trailers, the 2 characters visit Venice, and that's actually foreshadowed when they read a book about Venice. But what's interesting about that is that the way that she foreshadows it is suddenly just cutting in a shot of, I think, one of the major churches in Venice, reflected in a puddle as a bell rings. It's this totally incongruous image, and then suddenly it makes sense later on. Now, it's stuff like that that makes me think Hogg is getting more comfortable and starting to play, that maybe we're moving away from the excellent but quite homogeneous films that she made in the first section of her career, maybe, and into this really interesting and more experimental, I think, more playful version of her work. Curiously, the person who it reminded me of the most was Derek Jarman, who of course used Super 8 quite a lot in his work. And often I think Jarman uses that to reflect a kind of subjective or personal view. He often talked about the personal cinema. And I think in a way, that's what Hogg's doing here. Because of course these are to some extent her memories that she's fictionalizing and rebuilding on screen. And so she's using that Super 8 to reflect the perspective of the main character, who's a fictional version of herself. There's a number of archive photography and moving image shots in the film, and I'm curious to know whether they're drawn from her own work. I know that she shot a lot of stuff on Super 8 because she met Derek Jarman in Patisserie Valerie in Soho, back when that was like the one Patisserie Valerie. And then he gave her a camera. And so in a way, I think Derek Jarman's very early and I think quite small involvement in Joanna Hogg's development as a filmmaker is kind of playfully reflected in her choice of medium and even actors here. Hogg also contrasts those two sections of the film through her use of music. Anthony is a big opera fan, so there's often loud opera playing in his sequences, and sometimes playing against tone. There's this sex scene that's really almost fetishized and deals a lot with their sexual dynamic, that's played with this ominous opera over the top. It unsettles the audience and makes them think of new connections and new meanings that might be being implied by Hogg in this sequence. But there's also a fight between that music and the more popular music that's used as scene setting, and also in the livelier sequences of the film, where Julie is alive and with her friends. And it makes those two sections of the movie, you know, this kind of shaky, handheld, pop music driven interactions with her friends, and the static, slow, echoey, long shots and opera of the sections with Anthony feel very different. And there's only a few rare examples in kind of heart-rending situations where that style meets in the middle, and we have Anthony shot with Super 8 in a kind of shaky, cutesy almost style. All of Hogg's previous films have autobiographical elements, and it's something that she's been really noted for, but this film takes it a step beyond that and is in fact largely an adaptation of a number of episodes in Hogg's real life. But like everything in Hogg's previous work, this isn't straightforward and it's open to interpretation. The sections of the film that take place at the Raynham Film School, which is a thinly fictionalized version of the National Film and Television School where Hogg actually studied filmmaking, those sections of the movie are used really cleverly, because instead of being a meta-commentary on just filmmaking in general, it feels a lot more like Hogg talking specifically about her own work. The opening of the film is essentially a pitch of a movie that reveals a lot about Julie's character, and again I think is drawn from a real pitch that Hogg did as part of her application to the NFTS. And it's a kind of naive movie. It reveals Julie as this rich girl who grew up in a privileged environment, but for some reason wants to make stories about poor people living in working class environments and on the edge of poverty. Now here, Hogg is really skewering herself in a sense, not just Julie. All of Hogg's previous movies have been noted for how openly upper middle class they are. They revolve around scenarios and settings that could only really happen if you're an upper middle class person. I've never been on a Tuscan villa holiday. I've never had an argument with my family about whether or not we should invite the cook that's catering for us to eat with us as well. I don't think she's ever really interrogated class as much as she does here. Julie is openly being discussed by other characters in the film as an example of privilege. And one of the ways that her character changes is that she moves from this kind of documentarian looking at poor people essentially from the outside and trying to make these very woke, I think we would call it now, class narratives, to making these much more abstract and fictionalized narratives, which again mimics Hogg's early work. The very first short film of Hogg's that I know about is a movie actually with Tilda Swinton when she was like 21, which draws this nicely full circle, because if you haven't heard, Tilda Swinton is in the film playing her real life daughter's mother. In this early film that Hogg made, Tilda Swinton plays a young woman who is kind of drawn into this film glamorous magazine in a kind of pastiche of the way that those were photographed. And again, that feels very different to the films that Hogg is making now. So I don't know if the Souvenir 2, which is apparently already being made, will feature Hogg kind of moving further away from that again. But it's an interesting choice to use that narrative as part of an autobiographical story, because she's prompting us to consider the fictionalization that she's used on her own story. And it's something the characters discuss essentially in the film. It can be surprisingly meta at points. In one part of the film, Julie and Anthony, this unsuitable suitor that she has, are talking about this film that she's pitched to the NFTS. And he says, you know, is it real life? What story are you trying to tell here? And she says something to the tune of, they're real characters in a real place, but I have fictionalized them and I've made new ones to tell the story that I want to tell. In and amongst all of the wonderful artistic stuff that Hogg is doing in the film, I should really loop back around and just talk a little bit more about the performances that are in the movie. Tilda Swinton's been trailed a lot, but she's actually not in the film that much. She's a really important character and she's played extremely well. And she's in one of the most important scenes in the film, which I'm not going to discuss because I really don't want to spoil it for you. But the two leads, Honor Swinton Byrne playing Julie and Tom Burke playing Anthony, are astonishing and revelatory. I've seen Burke in a number of things. I don't really feel like he's had a chance to stretch his wings on screen as much as this, and he is so clever and capable in the way that he communicates the manipulativeness and the nastiness of this character, as well as this sort of weakness and a desire for emotional connection. And playing opposite him is the kind of astonishingly inexperienced Honor Swinton Byrne, who does an amazing job here rendering basically the director's early life. I think one of the most interesting things that she brings to the role is that she is new and inexperienced, and it helps, I think, in the film. It makes these sequences where Anthony is undercutting Julie and making fun of her and playing with her in a kind of cruel way much more stilted and scary. She looks like she's kind of flinching back, or she's shocked at how kind of nasty he can be in those sequences. She plays that fantastically well, but she also has this inner strength. I don't necessarily mean the character, but the actor here. She feels fine in opening herself up to being on screen, just inhabiting the character. And in the dreadfully sad sequences in the film, that really comes to the fore. She feels like she's giving herself to the movie. I'm going to talk very briefly about some spoiler stuff because it's so important to this film, but if you haven't seen the movie, then I suggest waiting and not watching the rest of this video, okay? The big part of the film that's been, I think, quite well hidden by the trailers is that Anthony is revealed to be basically a heroin addict, and the later parts of the film revolve around that kind of problem, the issue that that brings to their relationship and also to his life. For people who have experience of family members and friends with addiction, this will be really, really difficult to watch. I know I found it really painful at times, but I was struck by how well Burke inhabited that character, how well he showed the mood swings of the addict, and also by how well Swinton Byrne was able to portray that little sliver of hope that people who love an addict have. The way in which you have to just wait and hope that everything will turn out to be okay. And so in the final moments of the film, really, where it isn't okay, and as Tilda Swinton's character says, the worst has happened, that really quiet ability to show a mental state without performing any major action comes to the fore, and Honor Swinton Byrne does that astonishingly. And it's nice to see that despite all that stylistic playfulness, Hogg is very careful and clever about how she handles that plotline. I think the best example of this is the sequence in which Julie discovers that Anthony is a heroin addict, and it happens really casually. Early in the film, they're lying in bed together and she notices, needle marks on his arms. It's kind of implied that she doesn't really know what that is. She's that naive. She doesn't really understand what it is. And then later on in a dinner party with one of Anthony's friends, Anthony leaves the table for a bit, and Anthony's friend, who's played fantastically by Richard Ayoade in a single sequence in the film, probably one of the best moments in the movie. Lucky him, good bit of casting. It's this really funny sequence where he's this kind of dickhead who has a lot of opinions about movies and about musicals in particular, which I know that Hogg is a huge fan of. And in the middle of that conversation, he kind of just says, well, I don't understand how you, someone who's so sweet and nice, is going out with a habitual heroin user. Again, Swinton Byrne is phenomenal in the scene because she just can't seem to take it in. And it's almost funny. There was a couple of laughs in the screening that I was in, but it's also shocking. And I think that is a release of tension more than anything else. She just literally didn't know. She doesn't understand. And to the audience, that's kind of unbelievable, I think. But to her, it's unbelievable too, for a completely different reason. She has to start to reconcile that image she has in her head of her lover as this kind of cultured guy with this demon in him, this addiction that's referred to in the film as a kind of beast. I can't really describe it as well as it's done in the film, so I'm just going to stop, but I think that's a really clever sequence that Hogg handles magnificently. And the other thing I want to talk about is that final moment in the film. There are interludes throughout the film where Julie reads letters from Anthony as a kind of voiceover, and they're played over this pastoral view of the skies over, I think, 4 trees in the distance. It's a really beautiful frame, but what's amazing about it is that I assumed that was just the countryside that they visit when they go to see her parents, but it's actually viewed in the very last shot of the film, where In an immensely dark hangar that's being used as a movie studio, the doors at the end of the hangar open up and reveal this slice of light, and then we see that view that's been so emotionally important for some of the stronger, sadder beats of the film. We have that kind of memory made within the film where we realise the view we're looking at is the one that we've been seeing throughout the movie, underpinning these stories of Anthony. And it suggests to the viewer that it's almost a retrospective story. Well, I suppose it is, because it's Hogg's story that she's telling in a fictional way, but also it's like the film has been structured from that moment. And that's where we really begin to understand the narration that runs throughout in those sections of the film. It's as if Julie's looking out at that view and reading his letters to us. And I think that's the same thinking behind the recurring shot of Venice that appears in the movie too. And all of this happening while Anna Calvi's beautiful song Julie, that I can't seem to find online anywhere, is playing underneath. It's really amazing to me to see how Hogg changes in this film, how different this movie is to her previous work, and yet how easily it fits in continuity with what she's done in her previous work. That's it from me, but I think this film has a lot that we could talk about further. And so if you've seen it and you want to discuss it, or if you just want to talk in general about Hogg's work, then let me know in the comments down below. And also, if you want to know more about Hogg's previous movies, then you can check out the video essay that I did for British film magazine Little White Lies, which is linked in the description and also in a card on this sequence. So join me in the comments, let's have a chat about this phenomenal movie, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.